Look deep, deep into my eyes. You are witnessing a demonstration of the awesome power of the human mind. The unlimited potential of total concentration. My mind is totally focused, able to maintain absolute and utter control. A mind such as this is a powerful force. It could even rule the world.
Hey!
Huh?
Hey there, everybody. PTPOP here on Call Center Survivor, where I lead you out of the rabbit hole, one grain of truth at a time. And today, we are going to be tackling this fine book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And before we dive into this topic, let me tell you that the song you hear behind me is one of my brand new songs called Call Center Blues, which you can buy on my Patreon channel. And for, I think it's like $2.99 or something like that, for just like a Starbucks coffee, you can have your very own copy of Call Center Blues. Like and subscribe is the cheapest and easiest way you can support this channel. And many of you write to me and you say, Pete, I love your channel. I love how funny you are. I love everything you do. I don't understand why you're not bigger than you are. Well, that makes two of us, actually. That makes me and several hundred other people or 1,000 people. The best way to get this channel to grow is with your help, free of charge. You got friends that work in call centers, you dislike the corporate world, forward my channel to them in an email. Just say, hey, look, listen to this guy's channel. And we will watch it grow together. I recently reached 2 million views, but I still haven't reached 10,000 subscribers. So let's work together, my friends. So I did read the entire book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. This is kind of my forward to this video. I attempted this video 5 different times, and I was going to do a deep dive into this book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. I did complete it, but I wrestled with this book a great deal, and I decided instead of doing just a deep dive review, what you're going to see here is just my gut reaction to the overall Paul is dead conspiracy combined with my reaction to this book. So if you're expecting a deep dive review, chapter by chapter, section by section, I think the book is too deep. It's too deep and too detailed for me to go into it. So enjoy the video. If you're expecting a complete review, I just couldn't bring myself to do it because I didn't buy into the official narrative of this book. So with that, I leave you my final review of the Memoirs of Billy Shears. But I will also be doing other reviews of my instincts and my gut feeling about Paul is Dead and the Beatles as a band. Thanks a lot. And I'm going to keep this short and sweet because I tell you, I have my doubts about this book. But before I get to that, let me start off by saying, as you can see behind me, I've got my homage to the Beatles there with the moon underneath Paul McCartney. And when I was a child, when I was 8 years old, I discovered the Beatles. When I watched an anniversary special about the Beatles' first tour to America. So this was 1974, February 74, and I saw this newsreel footage and this news story about celebrating the 10 years since they had arrived in America and started the British invasion. And from the moment I saw that band on that little segment, I was obsessed. And I was obsessed with the Beatles and a huge Beatlemaniac until about the age of, oh man, it's sad. This is sad. Probably until I was like 38 years old or something like that. Maybe even later. And I started to grow tired of the band and I'm just tired of hearing the same songs over and over again. And I became weary of Paul McCartney's music that he had been releasing. And right now, here I sit. I'm still a fan of their music, but I'm not a fan of the men that made up the Beatles. But that's a whole nother story. So what I'm going to do here is this is not meant to put down the Beatles. This is not meant as a slight against them. This book, my review of this book, a slight against the alleged author or the ghostwriter that wrote this, Thomas E. Uharriet. It's not a slight against Mike Williams. Mike Williams of Sage Cray Radio introduced me to this book, and he introduced me to the concept and the theory that the Beatles may not be the band we all thought they were. So I slogged my way through this book, and as I read it, I had to keep in mind, it kind of slipped. I kept slipping between gears. One gear was, wow, this is written by the real guy that's playing Paul McCartney right now. And then I'd slip into another gear like, what the hell is this? And then I go back to, this sounds accurate. Then I'd slip into, what the hell is this? Back and forth. My brain went around the merry-go-round of this book. Now, this book is written, it has 666 pages, which is symbolic. The number that symbolizes Satanism and the devil. At least that's my basic elementary understanding of that number. I am not a Satanist, so I don't know the pure reason why 666 is significant to the devil, but it does, and I don't think it's that important, but it symbolizes occultism and things like that. Woven throughout the book are little codes and footnotes. There's little words that are bolded throughout the book. I don't know if you can see that, but it says, like, in these three sentences, it says, Paul just had to go. There's another here, in one sentence, it says, Paul's life reflected. The next sentence, a new seriousness until he died in September of 1966. So, and I believe the author, Thomas E. Uharriet, was a craftsman at doing this kind of coding. I know it has a type of coding, like a title to it. I'm not going to go into that because I do not want to spend a lot of time on reviewing this book or putting more energy into it than I already have. This, again, is not a slight against Mike Williams. Mike, I respect you all the way about your analysis and your theories of the Beatles, but I just don't know about this book. Now, the book opens with a foreword that is written by George Martin's eldest son, Gregory, I think it's Paul Martin. Gregory Paul Martin. Now, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Beatles, their producer, who basically shaped their recordings, was named George Martin. He was allegedly a genius producer that could do all kinds of things with sounds and worked with some great engineers such as G.F. Emmerich. But his son, Gregory Paul Martin, does the foreword in the book, which I started to read that at the very beginning of the book, and I said, no, hold on a second here. So if this is an occult type thing, where the Beatles were put together by Tavistock, and they were a manufactured band, and everybody had this, I'm going to kind of water it down a bit. If everybody had signed their soul to whatever nefarious force to keep this quiet and to alter Western civilization and destroy Western culture and the family values and Christian, I would think that Mr. George Martin's kids would probably be in on this in some way, shape, or form. I don't know, though. So I find it kind of suspicious that of all the obscure people you could write their forward to is the son of the producer, the eldest son of the producer. That's okay. But I can't find record of it now, but I found a recording or a reporter's interview with Mr. Gregory Paul Martin that said he never wrote that forward and he had nothing to do with the book. But then I've seen interviews where he talks exclusively about it, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it. My first problem with the book is that they start to discuss, or the author begins to discuss the death of Paul McCartney on a desolate country road on a rainy night, where he allegedly stops to pick up a hitchhiker who's stranded in the rain and she's carrying a suitcase or something. that's my basic 50,000-foot overview of it. But from the author's point of view, not just this scenario, but there's many scenarios that occur prior to Paul McCartney's death. Now, for those of you not aware of Paul McCartney and the conspiracy of Paul is dead, allegedly, on September 11th or thereabouts of 1966, Paul McCartney died. Some say it was an accident. The book implies it was an accident. The book says it was an occult, ritualistic sacrifice. And I don't want to go into that either because I'm not an expert in that kind of stuff. But the story is Paul died in 1966 and he's replaced by a look-alike or a stand-in. And the stand-in took over and he kind of navigated the ship until 1970 until the band broke up. And I have so many issues with this theory that it makes me torn because I do believe, and again, I'm going to give credit to Michael Williams about him discovering that the band was not the band we all thought they were, that they were manufactured by the Tavistock Institute. So back to my original approach here. So there's a variety of places throughout the book where the author is omnipresent. He's everywhere all the time. So the author begins to tell the story of the death of Paul McCartney, where he's driving down a cold, desolate country road somewhere in England. It's pouring down rain, and he happens to stop and pick up a woman who's hitchhiking or whatever she's doing. She's stranded in the rain. And there's a long story behind it that somehow the author knows all about. And they specifically know what happened in the car, or they're guessing what happened in the car. Like this woman realized that the person that picked her up was Paul McCartney and she freaked out and she was trying to, yeah him or something. I don't know. She was going crazy because, imagine if you're in the thralls of Beatlemania and you discover a Beatles picked you up on the side road, you'd probably want to try to jump his bones or whatever. Or there's a theory that, I don't know, a deer ran in front of the car and he crashed a tree, or he lost control of the car and hit a tree and Paul was decapitated. The part about this book, this is the very beginning of the book, and this is where I started to really feel like I didn't believe the narrative. And this is where the author, who is allegedly Billy Shears, who's allegedly William Campbell, who is this guy that was made up to look like Paul McCartney, who kind of already looked like him. Throughout the book, they tell me he had plastic surgery, and they nipped and tucked his face to make him look kind of like that. This guy seems to know facts and details prior to 1966 when he allegedly became part of the group that he'd have no way of knowing, that no one would have any way of knowing, up to and including the death of Paul and how he died, who was on the car, how it happened, because both Paul and the young lady died in the car crash. So that's my first problem, is the author seems to be omnipresent. He seems to be everywhere all the time, or omnipotent, which is usually a word thrown around with Jesus. And I know John Lennon has made reference to Paul McCartney as being Christ-like. He's known religion from Jesus to Paul. And there's another section of this book that really stood out to me related to Sgt. Pepper band. And it's about the arm patch that Paul McCartney is wearing on his left arm sleeve, where the arm patch allegedly says OPD. And I've seen this too. I've seen it on the album cover. And it's kind of funny to watch this to read this, because I've seen what the patch really is. And it doesn't read OPD. It reads OPP. That's been proven. That's an actual fact. So this is my copy of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that I inherited. My sister gave it to me from her collection in 1975. The album was released 8 years before. It was in her collection. I was 9 years old. And I got this record home, and I put it on the turntable, and I didn't know what to make of it. It didn't sound like the Beatles to me. This is where I vacillate between the official narrative of the Beatles and what I think really is. They didn't look like the Beatles. Paul didn't look like Paul to me as a kid. And John doesn't look like John. Ringo and George look similar. But my point to this is, on the inside sleeve, now this is torn and tattered. Look at this thing. I did not take good care of my records. Fold out. Maybe call it a bifold record. And here on the inner sleeve, we got the 4 Beatles, and Paul has this patch on his arm, which I'll show you on the screen here. This patch that everybody says, it says OPD, which allegedly means officially pronounced dead. But I have found pictures, and I've found things that reverse that it actually stands for, it really is OPP, which is the Ontario Provincial Police, which I've seen interviews with whoever is Paul McCartney right now, saying, yeah, I got this patch from this guy when we were on tour in Ontario, and the police chief gave me this patch, or gave the patch to John as a symbolism of, I don't know, thanks or whatever. You know, just a little trinket they gave him to represent Ontario, and so on and so forth. So as I'm reading this book, it starts talking about how what they did is the fake Paul, Billy, whoever he is, William, they decided to shoot the picture intentionally, this picture, and they shot it in such a way to make sure the patch was bent. In the book, it says this: they bent the clothing and the patch so they couldn't read that it said D. So they bent it so that they couldn't, that the public, that you and I, the general viewer of this inner cover of the album, they didn't want us to see that it read OPP and not OPD. So OPD would be officially pronounced dead. So this is where now this is part of the book. This is only like 246 pages in, and it's one place where I really began to question the narrative, because I don't know, a bizarre little nuance that seems a little bit like it would be too much, almost too much to believe, because the real patch says OPP, and this guy makes up the story, whoever the author is. We bent the patch so what people would think it said something else than it did. I'm paraphrasing quite a bit. So I began to lose faith in the book at that point, among other places. The other place was how this guy is omnipresent. He seems to know exactly what happened when Paul McCartney allegedly died in a car crash with another woman in the car. Like, they knew all about this woman. They knew where she was coming from. They knew where Paul was coming from. They knew what the weather was like. They knew that it was raining. They knew that he slid off the road, hit a tree or something, and was decapitated. And I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about how this book is kind of basically driven from the point of, here's this guy who allegedly was recruited into the Beatles. At first, he didn't know exactly that Paul had died. He didn't know. And in the book, it says, hey, Brian Epstein approached me and said, hey, you want to play in the Beatles or something along those lines. And, this guy, William Campbell or Billy Shears or whoever he is, thought he just meant for a night or two. And Brian made it clear to him that, this would be a permanent thing. Now, I don't remember the whole thing, but so here's a guy, William Campbell, was in another band called the Pepper Pots, and he was a studio musician. He's a very talented guy, studio musician. He was in another band called the Pepper Pots, I think. And he was just doing his thing behind the scenes, playing on other people's records, playing on his own records. He was also a songwriter. And then all of a sudden, he's a part of the Beatles. So this is a grown man who was recruited to be in the Beatles to replace Paul McCartney, who allegedly died in a car crash. And this guy had to give up his entire identity. He had to give up everything. He had to give up his name, his looks. He had to walk away from his life. He was isolated from his friends and family. And when I started to read that part of the book, I began to even lose more faith in the book, because here's a guy in the book. It states he had to go through plastic surgery. He had to have his face changed. He had to have everything changed to fit into the role of Paul McCartney. Now, the thing, there's so many things that kind of make me wonder about the official story, the official narrative, which is the Beatles were just these nice, four official lads, these fun lads that just happened to stumble into fame and fortune, and the conspiracy theory. But the thing that I find hard to believe is that a grown man who was initially intrigued by the power of the fame and fortune of being a Beatle gave up everything for it. I mean, this is the quintessential selling your soul to the devil story. He gave up he even gave up his identity to be famous. It's almost like a storybook within a storybook. Because the Beatles' fame and fortune is a story. It's a fable. It's almost gotten so big. The myth is so big and so unbelievable. It's even now more than apparent to a lot of us that the official narrative of the Beatles story there's no way it could be the way it was portrayed and sold to the media. So here's a man who allegedly gave up everything to sit in the place of Paul McCartney. And he just happened to be a genius musician that could play a variety of instruments and could write and everything and do everything like crazy. He could write, he could record, he knew several instruments, he could play the piano. And there's another story where they talk about how, this is another place where I got confused. There's a telegram that Brian Epstein, when he found out Paul had died. Now, Brian Epstein was the Beatles manager. And he allegedly found out Paul had died and sent John a telegram to Spain. John was in Spain filming How I Won the War, which is a movie John made in 1966. And if you've ever seen this movie, it's atrocious. It's an embarrassment. John Lennon is an embarrassment in that movie. The only reason he's in that movie is because he's a Beatle. It's horrible in it. I saw it once. I remember almost puking when I saw it. But anyway, so Brian Epstein. I said George Martin before. I met Brian Epstein as their manager. He sends a telegram to John. I think it was kind of like this cryptic telegram saying, hey, Paul is dead. And John gets back to London, or Brian went to Spain. I don't remember the story, but he shows John a picture of Paul either in the crash or in the morgue with his head smashed in or gone, and John loses his shit. This is another place where the author is omnipresent. He's omnipotent and seems to know everything that went on. Now, it's explained a little bit later on in the book, but this is another part of the book that I don't exactly agree with or believe in. Okay, so here's John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. And these are the most powerful, famous musicians in the world, and they may still be the remaining ones. Ringo and Paul, William, whoever he is, are still one of the most popular musicians of all time. So John finds out that his good friend is dead. He's being replaced by Billy from Pepper Potts. At least that's how I read it. Now think about this. If you're in a band, right? Let's say you're just in a band, you're in a real famous local band, and you find out one of your lead people just got killed. If the official narrative is true and John and Paul were that close, there's no fucking way you'd be able not to lose your shit. if he died that way in a violent car crash, he got his head smashed in, you just saw a picture of him on the slab with his head gone, you just would fucking lose your shit. You'd go nuts, man. And John did go nuts. But then all of a sudden, he's like, okay, let's go make Sgt. Pepper's with this new guy. And from how I understood it, John knew that Paul was dead. But even if he wasn't dead, you know, what if you walk in the studio and you look at this guy, the replacement guy, to me, see, I believe there's a replacement. I believe there's two Pauls. In reality, I think there's the double, and then there's the real Paul. And they use that as kind of a joke, or they would send Paul, the double, out to go for photo shoots and audience meets and talk show, things like that. Because there's obviously differences, physical difference between the two guys. I don't know if the real Paul had a double, like a twin at birth. I don't know if they're really, I've read stories where there's allegedly a double they saw at a concert, looked just like him, and they recruited him into the band. But let's say the other three Beatles didn't know, and in walks this guy that's taller than Paul, right? And he looks kind of like him, but everybody would be like, who the hell is this? Is this? You'd be like looking at him like, well, who is this? He kind of sounds and looks like him. I don't know, man. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I mean, I did slog through the book. A lot of it's explained. There's too many things to this that just don't add up. The story doesn't add up about the replacement in the life. The basic point of the book is here's this guy who was allegedly recruited by the Beatles to become Paul McCartney when Paul died. And he's lived his life as someone else for the last almost 60 years. And he wanted to kind of tell people about it without telling people about it, because the book is written as historical fiction, which is based some in fact, is based some in fiction, and is done that way to kind of throw people off. Because if he upsets the people who he agreed to sell his soul to, a lot of bad things could happen. My point of view in this whole situation is this. Well, I do not believe this book. I do not believe the narrative in it. I do believe much of what Mike Williams says, okay? Because I think something drastic happened in the 1960s. And I believe that there was some type of group, perhaps Tavistock and the CIA, a bunch of people working together to try to undermine Western civilization. And I do believe that there's something strange that happened in the early 1960s that started to revolutionize my country and Western civilization, where kids began to rebel against their parents, people began to put down Christianity, people began to split up their families, people became rebellious, sex revolutions, race revolutions, political revolutions of all sorts. It splintered our country and it began to fracture into pieces, and we haven't recovered since. And our country right now in 2025 is a mess. It's an absolute mess. We got boys thinking they're girls. We got girls thinking they're boys. Music has been splintered into 1,000 different pieces, from classical all the way up to hip hop and everything in between. Much of the beats you hear out there now are trance-like beats that put your brain into a trance. And I think music and music culture, the culture of music, has been used as a weapon against society to shape our minds, to shape our attitudes, and to fracture us into little pieces. So I think the Beatles were designed in some way, shape, or form to splinter, to be the spearhead, to splinter the world of music, to silence artists such as Elvis, Frank Sinatra, and the Everly Brothers, the big artists here in America when they hit the scene. Elvis is kind of already on the way out, but I think he's making a comeback from being in the army. And I think there's something strange that this is my belief. This is how I see it. I think the Beatles are not the band we think they are. I do not believe the official narrative in any way, shape, or form. Thank you to Mike Williams. It had never occurred to me, but I did have an initial inkling to think that perhaps they weren't that good because of an album called Live at the Star Club. Now, this is the album Live at the Star Club. It was released almost on the same date as Live at the Hollywood Bowl, the Beatles Live at the Hollywood Bowl. Got a nice romantic story with pictures of their time when they played at the Star Club in Hamburg, Germany, with people standing out front. And when I first heard this album as a little kid, I was almost 12 years old, I think, when it came out. Yeah, I was just about to turn 12. And I can tell you, I just hated it. I couldn't stand it. It's a live recording, caught on tape with just a tape recorder, an old-fashioned tape recorder somebody put on a table somewhere and just hit record, recorded them live. So there's no professional recording, there's no mixing, there's no editing. It's just them raw. And when I first heard this album, I thought, and even as a kid, I wasn't even a musician yet. I just kind of remember going, this is awful. And I forced myself to listen to it. I completely forced myself because I said, I got this. Well, this is so cool. This is them live before they were famous. And I'm telling you, they sound awful on this. They're atrocious on this recording. And there's a huge pushback from EMI and the Beatles they didn't want to get it released. This is before John had died and George had died. The four Beatles were still there. And they pushed hard not to get it released for some reason. I've always wondered, well, why wouldn't you want this released? If you guys are the great musicians you all say you are, let's hear it, man. But the song list on here is all cover tunes. They open with an original, I Saw Her Standing There, then it's Roll Over Beethoven, Hippie Hippie Shake, Sweet Little 16, Lend Me Your Comb, Your Feet's Too Big, Red Sails in the Sunset, Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, Matchbox, Talking About You, Shimmy Shake, Long Tall Sally, and Remember You. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 songs, and only one's an original. That's side 1 and 2. Side 2 and 3 is Twist and Shout, Mr. Moonlight, Taste of Honey, Besame Mucho, Reminiscing, Kansas City, Ain't Nothing Shaking But the Leaves in the Tree, To Know Him is to Love Her, To Know Her is Love Her, Little Queenie, Fallen in Love Again, Ask Me Why, Bebopalula, and Hallelujah, I Love Her So. So of those 1, 2, 3, 4, 13 songs, I think 2 are originals. So these are 4 guys. Well, this is Pete Best on drums. Ringo is in the scene in this recording. So these are guys, 3 guys. They're allegedly prolific, genius songwriters, and all they cover are 2 original songs. Everything else are cover tunes. Now, granted, you're playing in a bar in Germany, and you can't just sit there and play originals all night. But apparently they only had 3 decent original songs. And this recording is from, I think it's 1962. So within months of this recording, they were signed to EMI in England and had a #1 hit with Please Please Me. They went to number 18 or something with Love Me Do. And then they went to #1 by 1963 with, I think, Please Please Me. My dates might be off. So the point I'm making is, I believe the official narrative is a lie. I do not believe that these guys were the band we're told they are. They definitely are not nice lads from Liverpool. These are 4 men who were in the peak of their post-adolescence, and we all know guys, 4 guys, young guys, and the one thing, I don't know what it's like to be gay, but when you're straight, you're thinking about one thing, doing the magic nasty. These are 4 guys that are hopped up on pills and booze that were doing magic nasties with hoes and getting young ladies making babies with young ladies that they never took responsibility for. And I always wonder, why were they in Germany? I mean, the trip from Liverpool to Germany is a long, arduous journey, especially when they drove their van and had to go across a ferry, and go across the channel on a ferry, and then drive another several hours to get to this gig in Germany. Why all the way to Germany? And I know it's all explained in the history books, allegedly. But the thing I just don't get is the official narrative of the Beatles is suspicious now that I'm older, and it doesn't make any sense. You listen to this recording, these guys stink. They're terrible. They're not good musicians. They're not great singers. And then they'll say, well, they put Ringo Starr in and it all changed because he added a certain pop on the drums. He was a human metronome, you know, all that stuff they say about Ringo. And the officials, everything about this story is shaky. But if the official story was concocted by Tavistock and Tavistock had recruited these guys or had pulled them out of their families and maybe brainwashed them into becoming agents of Tavistock to change Western culture, maybe they sent them to Hamburg to cut their teeth to, you know, to get accustomed to being famous, to get them accustomed to playing live, to earn their way and, you know, work on their chops so they could eventually stand in front of large crowds. But Tavistock would have to have some way of knowing that the band would eventually evolve into what they evolved into. If the Tavistock angle is true, the Tavistock Institute would have had to have a pretty good idea that these were the guys and it was going to work and it was going to change Western civilization. Because I would think if you're an occult organization or you're a deep state organization, you'd have to have some way to make sure that they were going to be popular and they were going to make it big, or have a way to manipulate the masses to make them think, yeah, these are the people. These are the guys that are going to change everything. Because without that, what would be the point in investing in it? There's no surefire way of finding out. This is where I vacillate between, you know, one gear and the other, because how did they know this would work? They're going to put all this time and energy into recruiting 4 young guys out of Liverpool and having them earn their keep in Hamburg, Germany, in the Reeperbahn district with all these gangsters and hookers and hoes and drug addicts and stuff. Why would you do that unless you knew what the outcome was going to be? How would you know? Would you have agents in the audience watching the fan reaction, watching the hysteria grow in there? Did they do something to manipulate the audiences? Because the thing that I don't understand about the Beatles is how did they get women and young girls to scream their heads off and go crazy about these guys? Just insane. Just like women just wetting themselves, screaming till they passed out, some having O's, O''S, if you know what I mean, from the hysteria, getting so excited. When you look at these 4 guys when they were young, you can detach yourself from this band, from your hysteria of the Beatles. Kind of weird looking guys. They're not your traditional white Anglo-Saxon American or anything. They're odd looking men. And it was kind of like, I always thought when as a kid, I thought John had this weird flat looking face and Ringo had this huge nose and Paul had this round, like puppy dog eyes. George looked kind of weird and evil. I just remember seeing like, those guys are good looking. I mean, it wasn't what I grew up thinking, like good looking guys were supposed to be like the blonde haired, blue eyed Aryan type that were lifeguards at the pool and stuff. But then they shoved them down our throat and said, oh, these are the guys. They're so good looking. Oh my God, look how gorgeous they are. I'm like, no. They sold us a whole bunch of stuff back then that I just don't know how we got there. I don't know how they created that hysteria. And, but back to the book, the book goes on and on and on. And I got to tell you, I don't buy the book. I don't buy the narrative in the book. I don't buy that there's this guy out there pretending to be Paul McCartney. There are things that point to it where, Olivia Harrison refers to him as Billy when he's over at the Rock Hall for a ceremony or something. And a couple of different people refer him to as Billy. Maybe it really happened. But think about all the things that had to go into place. I mean, this is what I'm going to conclude with. The official narrative of the Beatles is a miracle. The official story we've all been sold is that 4 guys, John, Paul, George, and Ringo, all 4 of them were geniuses. Okay? and they got together and made a band, and their music was genius. And they rose to this immense power and stardom overnight because they were geniuses. And it's never been duplicated since, and it was never done before. It's the most outrageous story in the history of music, if not of the world. I mean, what's the likelihood? And how many geniuses do we all know? I mean, when I was a kid, it was always Albert Einstein. He was the genius. Now, it's gone on and on to different people. But how often do you get 4 geniuses in a group in the same room doing the same thing, working the same project, going the same direction? It doesn't make any sense. My official thought of this is I think they wrote mediocre tunes that were pushed down the public's throat and told they were genius. And they were told, this is good music, 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 they're good looking, this is good music, they're good looking, they're gorgeous. This and somehow, either subliminally or overtly, they bombarded us because I wasn't alive. I was alive in the 60s, but I didn't know about the Beatles till 1974. They did something to make people think this is really, this is the bomb, man. This is what every kid's got to listen to. The whole thing seems so far-fetched. So they push this narrative. 4 young guys are just 4 geniuses, and they just happen to all get together, and they just happen to write this allegedly great music, and they rose to the top. It doesn't make any sense, guys. None of it makes any sense. The official narrative, in my opinion, is a lie. Absolute lie. I don't know who these guys are. I don't know where they came from. I've heard now as a grown man, listen to their music objectively because I'm a songwriter and I'm a musician. I perform in front of people. Their songs are insipid in most cases. Most of their stuff is insipid. And there's all these people out there now on YouTube that just drool over their music and fawn and faint over their songs, analyzing the lyrics and the rhythms and the chords as if, they were just mad geniuses. Guys, if you don't know music, if you don't know the recording industry, this is the other part of it that doesn't make any sense. The Beatles were not good musicians. That's my professional opinion. They were not good musicians. Another thing I know for a fact is the music industry, whether it's in Europe or in America, does not invest their money on potential. Meaning if a band walks into their studio for a demo, the powers to be that are looking at how many dollars they can make off of young men and young women in the music industry don't go, you know what? They've got a certain something. I think they've got potential. No. Now, when you walk into that studio, you've got to have the look. You've got to have the talent. You've got to have the sound. You've got to have something. These guys didn't have that something. And it's painted as if George Martin, has a meeting with them after their first audition and he brings them back. He doesn't like them at first. He wants nothing to do with him. He brings them in for a meeting as well. Boys, tell me what you didn't like. And George said, well, I don't like your tie. And George Martin says, well, from that point forward, I love their irreverence. So I gave them a chance. I mean, come on, guys. This is the record business. This is the next best thing to the mafia. This is the cutthroat business. And they don't invest their time and money on potential. You got to have it. Walk in there. You have to grab record executives by the throat with your music and your presence and your charisma and have somebody go, yeah, these guys are it, man. That's where I don't buy it. The story, the narrative, you take this book out of the picture, the narrative doesn't make any sense. Absolutely doesn't make any sense. And the other thing about all of this is maybe Paul did die and was replaced by a double, but something happened after Sgt. Pepper, and it seemed like the band fell apart. What caused them to fall apart? They blamed it on touring, so they became withdrawn and went into the studio. They made Sgt. Pepper with their mindset on making the world's greatest record album in the world. But when I first heard that record as a kid, when I first heard Sgt. Pepper's in stereo, I hated this as a kid. I hated this album. I couldn't listen to it. I couldn't even, it's all torn up because I've moved a lot over the last 50 years. But it's dark. It's murky. The album cover to me is bizarre. The back cover is dark, blood red, and murky. But after Sgt. Pepper, everything went to shit. So, I don't know. Maybe it went to shit because Paul really died and the other three guys didn't like William Campbell or Billy Shepherd or Billy Shears or whatever the hell his name is. And John started shooting smack. Yoko entered the picture, and I think Yoko was John's handler. I think she was more like a CIA asset. It kind of got John hopped up on smack. And he couldn't handle what had happened to the band and what had happened to his friend. And he was now stuck in this band and he couldn't get out. So the only way to escape was to numb himself with heroin. I don't know. But if you ask me, the next album after Sgt. Pepper, Oh, the Magical Mystery Tour, was the White Album. And the White Album, to me, is like a bunch of junk. It's like a bunch of crappy records, songs that they just threw together in the studio. It's sloppy. The recordings are sloppy. It's a weird sound. It's completely a divergent sound from Peppers. It's a divergent sound from Magical Mystery Tour, Revolver, and Rubber Soul, their most recent records. It's like just four drunks walked in the studio. It's like, oh, you say you want to have a little, well, you know, cha-cha. What is that sound? It's a completely divergent thing. And the other thing that makes me question the Beatles' official narrative, you look throughout history, all the big acts, Sinatra, Elvis, The Who, the Stones, when you pull up any of those bands on any of the streaming platforms or pull out your vinyl, Talking Heads, whatever band, you always know you're listening to a Talking Heads album. You always know you're listening to a Who, listening to Sinatra, or you're listening to Vivaldi, or whoever it happens to be, Beethoven. They have a key sound, a signature sound that you go, yeah, that's my favorite artist. But with these guys, their sound changed constantly between 1962 and 1970. So in those 8 years, they went from yeah, love me do to here come old flat top grooving up slowly. You start off with John Lennon shouting into the microphone for Twist and Shout and Mr. Moonlight and all these songs, to him singing through his nose in Sgt. Pepper's. I didn't even know that was John. To this day, it doesn't sound anything like a John Lennon singing. So how did they come up with all these different ideas and to write their music? They went in so many different paths and so many different directions. It's unheard of in music. I mean, people like Sting and all these really phenomenal musicians will try different music, but you still know it's Sting. So if Sting puts out a country album, I don't know if he's ever done country, you know it's Sting. If James Taylor does, whatever James Taylor does, he just pretty much a folk rock singer, but if he does if he does a country album, you're going to get James Taylor. You're going to get his key signature sound. But how did their sound change so drastically so many times over the years? Do you know how hard it is to change your style? I mean, once you create as an artist in one way, it's very hard to make a 180 and completely change your style. Your brain is wired and your soul is wired to create in a certain way. So how did four guys change the drumming, change the bass playing, change the lyrics, change the sound, change the instrumentation? Well, Pete, they were just geniuses. You say they had George Martin, and he was the fifth Beatle, and they just did it that way. No, come on, guys. If you're a musician, if you're a real musician or a real artist, if you do oil paints, you do pottery, if you do recording, music, songwriting, anything, you stick to what works. And, if you paint oil painting and one day you wake up and you want to do watercolors and, if maybe not watercolors, but I'm trying to think of a parallel. The story doesn't add up is my point. I don't know how they did it. I think they must have had studio musicians in there saying, hey, let's try this. I don't know how else they did it. Because Ringo's drumming changes drastically. It's completely different. Absolutely different from Sgt. Pepper's Forward. You know, it's very simple. His drumming has always been simple, but it's a very loose, not a tight sound. It's very loose. It's almost as if all the studio musicians that were working with him up until 1966 said, fuck off, I'm done. We're done working with you guys. You guys can do your own thing. And I think by 1968, they had to go in the studio and do it all themselves for the first time in 6 years. There's something weird with the story. It doesn't add up. It just doesn't add up. So I'm going to leave it with that. You know, if I were to make any recommendation for this book, I don't remember how much this cost me. 666 pages. I think it was like $35 or something. Save your money. Don't buy it. I wouldn't buy this book. Stay away from it. I think it's a fantasy that somebody had in their head. It's well written. It's well structured. Whoever wrote it, Thomas E. Uharriet, and whoever co-wrote it with him, put a lot of time in this book. A lot of time. It's coded. It's got secret messages in it. It's specifically aimed at those conspiratorial people who think Paul died in 1966. I don't know. All I know is I still like some of their songs. I'm no longer a fanatic of the Beatles. I still watch some things on YouTube about it, but I get really nauseated when I see people like, oh, this album, Rubber Soul, is so amazing, you know. Oh, I listened to it over and over again, and I'm going to review it for you today. And I can't watch those things anymore. So let me know what you think in the comments. You know, if you really think Paul's dead and Billy Shears replaced him, and he's the front man of pretends to be a Beatle to this day along with Ringo, that's fine. I don't really care. I'm not putting down the Beatles. I'm not putting down you guys. I was a Beatle maniac at one time. Absolutely obsessed. And I would get into verbal fights with people about, you know, the Beatles versus Def Leppard or the Beatles versus Metallica. And they'd all say, the Beatles suck. Metallica rules, man. Metallica rules. Oh. And it was like I was a kid, and I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't even bother. Life is too short and too important to get into verbal altercations or physical altercations about these 4 drug addicts, womanizing drug addicts that somehow weaseled their way to the top of the charts. And I'll leave you with this. Think about this. All these wonderful songs they wrote between 1962 and 66, allegedly. How come they never really did it again after 66? You know, we had Martha, My Dear. I guess that was all right. I mean, my Guitar Gently Weeps is George, but, you know, Paul and John didn't really come together. I don't know. After 66, John started writing these monotone, like, you know, I don't know. It's like they never wrote the same things again. They completely changed styles artistically, which is so hard to do, people. It's really hard to do, especially when you're under pressure of a record company, recording contracts, press agents, managers, people bitching at you, out for photo shoots and making films. How do you just walk in the studio? Let's try it different today, boys. Ringo, you just play sloppy drums. John, you go on bass. I'll play the piano. We'll knock off Martha, My Dear. I don't know. Martha, My Dear, I keep saying when to end this, but I think about Martha, My Dear and the piano playing on that. It's supposedly Paul, I think. He's playing really good piano on there. So between 62 and 66, he had enough time to master the piano going, dun, dun, ticka, dun, 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 dun. You know, I don't know. It seems unlikely. So let me know what you think in the comments. I'm not going to comment on this anymore. Mike, you know, I love you. I love what you do, Mike Williams, that is. This is no slight against you. So, you know, please try not to get mad at me, but I don't like this book. I don't believe it. But I hope you'll still talk to me after that, because you've been a big help to me here on my channel. But I don't know. So there you have it. That's my take on the Memoirs of Billy Shears and the Paul is Dead thing, and I'm leaving it at that. So, all right, guys, I am going to hit the road here. And let me know what you think of the comments. Give me a thumbs up. Send me a DM at skatingbearstudios@gmail.com. And I will all see you on side 2. Hasta la vista, baby.
Hasta la vista. Adios. Adios, muchachos. You get out of here.
Is that all there is?